Hello there, and welcome back to Jolie's, where you can get spicy sausage, roasted nuts, and the freshest React content here on YouTube. Today, I'm going to be watching how The Last of Us ruined gaming. But before we get into that, I would really love to see how quickly we can get this community up to 100 subscribers. So, I would love for you to take whatever appendage you think is most appropriate and hit that like button, the subscribe button, and why don't you go ahead and ring that bell too while you're at it. With that out of the way, let's get into new React.
Whenever you're playing a video game, what are things that you look for when playing it? Is it the...
Well, let me see. For myself, I would just say evocative worlds that I can explore and interesting but not overly complicated gameplay.
graphics, the music, the levels, the story, or perhaps is it just the overall fun you're having while playing a game? Personally, besides good gameplay and good story, what I look for in a game is, am I having fun? And with most games I played throughout my life, I've always had that feeling. While yes, there are games where I've not felt that at all whatsoever, when it comes down to it, most of the time when playing a video game, I usually find myself having fun with a good amount of games.
Oh no, you must be mistaken. This came out 14 years ago.
As time...
I just watched a video earlier today that was a comparison between a cutscene from Star Wars Outlaws compared to a cutscene from Red Dead Redemption. Not Red Dead Redemption 2, the original Red Dead Redemption. And even though that was 14 years ago, the animation and the direction in the Red Dead Redemption 2, the Red Dead Redemption, the first one, was so much better. It was a very interesting breakdown. So yeah, I mean, games 14 years ago, still fun, looking great still. So, you know, graphics definitely shouldn't hold you back from contemporary gaming, or from retro gaming, I should say, especially not at this point.
And technology has advanced. We've gone from little 8-bit pixels in the 1980s to now the most realistic looking eye candy out there. And while that's awesome that we still got some nice shiny graphics on our games to the point where we're questioning how the heck does Kratos look more real than I do.
He definitely looks more like a daddy than you do. Sorry, but man, as somebody in the long hair club, you can't beat bald and beard.
But as nice as having good graphics are in games, we need to also have fun gameplay in them as well, because that's what makes a game engaging and also fun, so years from later after that, you want to go back and play it, and not just making it like a movie type experience. So, how is that lovely gameplay in video games nowadays?
It's been 30 minutes and I've done nothing but hold forward!
Say hello to the good old-fashioned trend in video games nowadays, everybody. Holding forward. Want to play a game where a character has a varied moveset and good gameplay and fun levels to go through? Well, who needs all that when you can just hold forward and listen to words? Forget fun gameplay mechanics, we're holding up to climb, baby!
Oh, what is this? This is so stupid!
And I know what you're asking. Who is the company that is responsible for this atrocity of gaming? And that is the one and only, the company that's now known for not knowing what to do with itself anymore, and that is Naughty Dog.
The Prestige Tour is something that Naughty Dog kind of invented, I believe, with the Uncharted series. And look, wonderful tool to use for storytelling and environment setting. It may have gotten out of hand. Some could say that it was like implementing what became known as the walking simulator into bigger games. But I'm looking forward to seeing what he has to say on the situation. But Naughty Dog definitely, I mean, basically coined an entire type of gameplay experience. I don't even know if I could call it a gameplay experience, but maybe a dramatic tool. Yeah.
Naughty Dog got their start in the late 80s with games like Math Jam and Ski Craze on the Apple II computer, but they wouldn't be really big up until 1996 when they launched the very first Crash Bandicoot game exclusively on the PlayStation on September the 8th. And this is what Naughty Dog would be doing for quite some time back in the 90s. They'd work on the Crash Bandicoot games for Sony, but unfortunately the successful run of the Crash games from Naughty Dog would end up coming to an end after Crash Team Racing. While Naughty Dog did make the games, they didn't own the Crash franchise. Universal did, and after Crash Team Racing released, Naughty Dog became a first-party developer for Sony. Thus, Universal had no dev team to make the Crash games, and they end up giving Crash to Traveler's Tales for Crash Wrath of Cortex to be the sequel to the other Crash games, and then eventually Crash Bandicoot would be handed over to Activision's Toys for Bob, which would be the ones to bring back Crash into the new realm of gaming and made a fantastic game of Crash 4, even though it didn't do as well as intended because people don't like platformers no more. But back to...
That's not totally true. I mean, people obviously liked Astrobot. At least the reviewers liked Astrobot. So, and I think the Mario games are still doing pretty well. I just think that I don't know. I didn't play the Crash 4 reinvention of the series. I could say like Crash Bandicoot was definitely a product of early 3D platforming, and if they stuck too close to the formula, then it probably wasn't innovative enough.
Naughty Dog, they managed to stay relevant with their new game series under Sony, being the game series called Jak, which is basically just a 3D action game of the sorts, kind of like most of the action games in the PS2 era of games. But Naughty Dog Studio would eventually reach their peak when they then made a new franchise that went on to be one of the most beloved Sony franchises ever. And I'm not talking about Jak, I'm talking about Naughty Dog's next big thing to meet gaming. Alongside other memorable and great franchises from Sony like God of War, Final Fantasy, Little Big Planet, or even back then with Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider, a new fantastic franchise came into play in the year 2007, and that was Uncharted.
Now here comes the fun part. As someone who has never played Uncharted, I have to now talk about it. So let me just hit up my friend and see if he can give me some info about.
Launching November 19th, 2007, exclusively for the PlayStation 3, Naughty Dog would launch their brand new game franchise being Uncharted. This franchise truly put Naughty Dog on the map for game development studios. Uncharted was a new type of action-adventure game of adventure exploration with stunning graphics for the time, and would be the birth of what would become one of Sony's most iconic characters, Nathan Drake. Alongside other characters like Ratchet and Clank or Kratos, Nathan Drake eventually would become a classic video game character in the Sony PlayStation market. When Uncharted launched in 2007, it was a commercial success from the start. It would even clock in at selling over 2.6 million copies by 2009, and that was pretty darn impressive for this being the start to a new series. And
I didn't realize the first Uncharted did that well, because the narrative around it is usually that Uncharted 2 is when they really figured it out. So I didn't know they had hit the ground running pretty well with Uncharted 1.
Eventually, many other titles were released afterwards. This game series was loved by a lot of gamers and critics. However, while Uncharted did revolutionize gaming with its epic storytelling, graphics, and lovable main protagonist, there are things that Uncharted has done to gaming that started making other game devs want a piece of that Uncharted success pie. One of the key examples is that around 2012, games started focusing on really big cinematic shots, just like the Uncharted games, specifically in game moments where you're climbing. In Uncharted, there's a lot of moments where you're holding forward a lot and watching stuff just happen on the screen. It's not too bad because there's still some good gameplay stuff here wise from these games. It's kind of like Tomb Raider a little bit. While Uncharted
Hold forward to run through an environment to get some storytelling, get some environment setting, that wasn't bad in of itself. You know, it's how far you take it is maybe the question, and how much agency you take away from the player. I'm not sure if he's going to get into it, but one of the things that I often think about, games started becoming nearly photorealistic enough to start crossing that divide between what games were, where they were very representational or quasi-abstract. There was this whole, I think, conversation about Ludo narrative disconnect, because things became so realistic. Actions you would take in games, back in the day, they could, in Streets of Rage or games like that, they could just have like food, like wild food, like a chicken breast or chicken thigh, whatever, fall down onto the ground, and you would know, oh, I picked that up in order to heal myself. And then as games became more realistic, or were getting closer and closer to realism, they actually had to start developing the, what would you call it, new visual language that was much more realistic for, you know, what can I interact with my environments? What can I, you know, what are items that I need, and what do they do? So then you had to have like med kits, which, you know, for health, which isn't the worst. But I think like we're starting to see, I think IGN just released a video about this, but we, you know, like the idea that you need to put yellow paint down, or, you know, to indicate that something can be interacted with, so players don't miss it, or they, you know, to do that communication. And it doesn't fit into the environment. It looks way more forced now versus, you know, back when it was like 2D pixel art, you know, side scrolling, that sort of thing. The fun of video games versus this, like, you know, realistic, like we're giving you a movie that you can play, you know, I don't want to, you know, kind of starts falling apart, or it starts showing the limitations, if you will.
Start this unfortunate trend, you'd think that this trend would eventually die out, and it probably would have if Naughty Dog kept only making Uncharted games. But we live in the timeline where Naughty Dog, in fact, did not only make Uncharted games. In the year 2013, Naughty Dog would come out with the game that would put Naughty Dog down in video game company history. Launching
Wow, only 6 years after the first Uncharted. That I find that amazing how quickly they embraced this gameplay style and were able to reinvent it. First major prestige drama of gaming.
June 14th, 2013, exclusively for the PlayStation 3, Naughty Dog would release what would be their most successful game to date, the game
Not
that would
anymore.
change everything in gaming, and that was The Last of Us. When it launched in 2013, it was an absolute smashing success, and it shows because the game sold 6 million copies nearly within a year of its release. This game was the thing back then.
Wow.
It made just about
That's like 3
everyone
times
want
as
to buy a
much.
PlayStation 3 at the time. And keep in mind, this was 2013. The PS3, it was on its way out by this point. The PS4 was just around the corner for that holiday season later that year.
That is like one of those things that I truly love in gaming is like the first great game of a console generation. And it's a shame because this is probably like we're coming to the end of the consoles. I'm pretty certain. But the first great game of a console generation, whether it was a release title or something that came out within a year of the console dropping, and then the last one, the final great hurrah that kind of culminated everything about that one console, like pushing it to its limit but doing it elegantly. There should be a Hall of Fame, or like there could probably be a video here of like that last great populist, everybody wanted to play this game. I'm pretty sure Super Mario Brothers 3 would be that for the NES. Obviously, like when it comes to kickoff games, Super Mario 64 is probably the best example of that, a game that the console is practically built around. Yeah, Last of Us definitely deserves that distinction. It was practically a PlayStation 4 game on the PlayStation 3.
But the fact that this single game about two characters, a once father and a child, all alone surviving in a post-apocalyptic world, made everyone want those PS3s back then. And for a good reason. The Last of Us is truly a fantastic experience with an amazing story that is amazingly well written and fantastically done characters that makes you feel for them. That's also backed up by the amazing voice acting from the voice actors. Everyone did a great job here. When playing this and seeing the characters interact,
I mean, yeah, it was a star-making game. I'm pretty sure it's Troy Baker who plays Joel. And that was a star-making performance. I mean, like, I don't think he's a household name necessarily, but the guy went on to play Indiana Jones. I really hope it wasn't Nolan North, though. Like, in the sense of, like, I really hope I didn't just embarrass myself by claiming that as Troy Baker as Joel, and it's been Nolan North the entire time. But yeah, I mean, like, give the man some credit for becoming one of the first great actors of video gaming.
them going through this apocalypse, it makes you actually feel like what's going on is almost real with how good the performance is from the voice actors and the dialogue that is being said. It's like watching actors on a movie or a TV show. And hey, wouldn't you know, The Last of Us would eventually get a TV show in 2023 on HBO Max. Bottom line is that The Last of Us is an amazing story experience with amazing characters, stunning visuals, and a really well done story. But it feels like we're forgetting something, aren't we? I mean, after all, this is a video game, so how is the gameplay of this, well, said video game?
I mean, I can hit people with a piece of wood, so I mean...
So as previously stated, I think The Last of Us is a...
I'm a simple man. Give me some wood, I'll hit people with it.
fantastic experience with an amazing story and really well done characters that truly make it a fantastic time, but not as a video game. When Naughty Dog released The Last of Us, they really want to deliver on an amazing story with this game and make you feel like you're in a cinematic experience, just like a movie almost. The gameplay, however,
I'm going to say that this feels like he's building up to a... They spent so much time wondering if they could. They forgot to stop to ask themselves if they should. Early 2000s, up through 2010, whatever, up until The Last of Us finally came out, and it was like teenagers who were playing PlayStation 2s and N64s and GameCubes. It needed to happen. It had to happen eventually, because we were all sitting back thinking, like, when are we going to get the great video game story, the great cinematic video game experience? It was kind of like an arms race, or like trying to, not even arms race, it was like trying to get to the nuclear bomb and who could get there first. If they didn't do it, somebody else would have, is essentially what I'm going to say. And not to excuse, like, where we've gotten to with it since then, because I'm ultimately, like, the reason I'm reviewing this video or reacting to this video is because the title was something that I instantly knew I agreed with, which is, you know, how The Last of Us ruined gaming. If it wasn't The Last of Us, it would have been something. You know, if you look at games from even right before that till up until recently, this was like kind of this pipe dream that we had, that we didn't know what it would change, for better or worse.
The Last of Us is like Naughty Dog's previous games from the Uncharted series. The gameplay style is basically an evolved Uncharted, except more linear in The Last of Us. And what I mean by linear is that there's not much exploration involved, unlike Uncharted. Sure,
Yeah, it's like discovery, if you will. Like, you discover what they want you to along the way.
some puzzle-like situations, but other than that, here in The Last of Us, it's just walking. Now, in some instances, like the opening, it's fine since it's us just starting out, but after that, you slowly start to realize, oh shoot, this is all I'm doing, isn't it? Now, I will say, granted, when it's time to fight infected or clickers, or when there's stealth missions, these are good moments of the game, and actually get me intrigued whenever I'm playing. But once you get done fighting off infected, we're back to holding forward and listening to stuff happen again. Look at this moment right here after you meet Ellie. This goes on and on with you just holding forward, listening to dialogue. Also, gotta love when there's moments when you can't sprint at all during this. Great touch there, game designers. Love it. The point I'm trying to get here is that The Last of Us is not a video game. It is a movie that you can interact with. This isn't really my particular game style right here. I like it when I have to be engaged in a game where I have to think about what I'm doing in games and not just watching stuff happen that I can interact with. A game where gameplay is at the front seat, where that's the first thing developers think about, and then the story comes later. In The Last of Us, the story
100%. Like, I want to play a game where the gameplay was almost completely sorted out, and then they figured out what to apply the gameplay to for a narrative. That's one reason I think, what was it called? Splatoon came out of the gate swinging, was because it was like a movement system first and foremost. If you look at the very early prototypes that they put together, then they figured out, well, how do we justify this movement system? There's, they can transform into squids and travel through this paint that they laid down, and squids put down ink or spray ink. Squids travel through water, all that jazz. And then from there, they've built up quite a, world and narrative. So I prefer to see that. It's like, and I'm a game designer. I've designed a board game or card game, and I do often say that when I sit down to design my next game, I'm going to have some theme that I'm working towards, because like I learned that mechanics aren't so inspired by your theme, but your theme should be a North Star that you're heading towards, and you should hold it there. Your theme / your game scope, you should be heading towards it, but it shouldn't really get crystal clear or become super defined until you are near the end of your journey. And that's when everything, those sorts of things should crystallize. Before then, it's just a ray of light guiding you. And if you want to hear more about my game design philosophies and everything like that, I'm sure I'm going to get into more videos here. But I have a channel called Joel Watts, I think, or The Joel Watts. That's where I'm going to probably post really off-topic things that don't fall into my Jolie's brand, and also Megamoth Studios, which is where I have my podcast with my game design partner, Danny Ayub. And we're probably going to start posting, we're going to document our next game design, which we're starting to break ground on right now. We're going to be posting much more videos like this, like probably the same background, but we're going to get into the nitty gritty of our journey designing the next game through developer diaries. So if you're interested in that, check out Megamoth Studios. I'm sure there's going to be more going on there.
Is at the very front seat and gameplay is in the back seat. But at the same time, it really kind of just works for this kind of game. While I don't prefer this style of gameplay, it really does work for The Last of Us. And it also seemed to work for Naughty Dog, because The Last of Us is now one of the most iconic video games of the 2010s. Whenever you talk about a game from the PS3 era, what is one of the first few that come to mind?
Wait. Let me think. PS3 era? Obviously Last of Us and Uncharted probably take the cake. What was that game? The shooter, like space Nazis? And they said era, so I should say that technically means Xbox 360 and Wii. On the Xbox 360 front, obviously there's Halo 3. On the Wii front, Wii Sports. Super Smash Brothers Brawl, Mario Galaxy, Beautiful Joe. Bayonetta was a PlayStation 3 game. No, that was PlayStation. I was going to say Shadow of the Colossus, but I'm pretty sure that was a PlayStation 2 game. Talk about another game. I think that was like a late stage PlayStation 2 game. They got away with so much environment by making those environments practically devoid of life, aside from the monsters that you slay. Well, that's my list. Let's see what he has. Skylanders. What are we talking about here?
There you go. I already know what you're thinking. But regardless, The Last of Us was very successful when it released in 2013 on the PS3, and even getting a remaster for the PS4 a year later, and thus allowing more people to have access to this game. But while
totally
The Last of Us
justified
is very
remaster.
successful and is now loved by many, what was the aftermath of gaming after The Last of Us? Because there was no way that this game came out with all the positive reception it had and all the love for it that it would not have left an impact. So, what was the impact? Well, you know how it usually goes if there is something that's successful for one person. Someone else will try their best to crawl out of the shadows and try to replicate that success. And most of the time, it doesn't end well.
Like I said, Naughty Dog cracked the code on how to do this cinematic gameplay that everybody had been trying to do and like throwing different things at the wall, figuring out, and they cracked the code. So of course, all these people who had been working on this for so long, I mean, like, how long does it take to make a game? Like, Super Rush, 2 years, maybe. That's like, you would have to have already got the engine in place and had been developing the game if you were at the 1 year mark on a game, you could maybe swerve to try to make a Naughty Dog Last of Us style game. Most likely 3 if you were starting from scratch. Like, you saw Last of Us, you saw what they were doing early, and you were like, we can also do that. Maybe 3 years from then. I would often talk about how much I don't care for Rockstar's game design in general, but even I have to admit that they do a much better job of balancing out gameplay versus like cinematic storytelling. They know when it's time for a cutscene versus when it's time to let the players, play a game. And they let the players play the game that they most want, that the Rockstar people most want to play. And so that's why I think those games are so successful. Versus I feel like Naughty Dog, and I'm just speaking out of pocket here, out of my own assumptions. Naughty Dog makes a game or makes these games because they are aiming for like an experience before they're aiming for something that they would sit back and have said, this is what I want to play. He brought up Death Stranding earlier, or showed off Death Stranding, but even then I would say Death Stranding, while it's arguably boring, I think boring is such a loaded term because I don't mean it in a negative way, but it's kind of a negative term. What's a good term for this that isn't boring? It's a nuanced game experience, but I think the gameplay is still core. It's like he wanted to make a game that was about systems management, which is what games usually should be about. They're either about systems management or they're about like twitch reflexes. And he, and his is a little bit of both. That's like, that's like the Venn diagram that you're almost like always pulling apart and putting together and deciding how much are you going to focus in on. Death Stranding is a great example of systems management with twitch reflexes and how they kind of play off each other. You set up your system management to allow yourself to minimize your twitch reflex, or like to enable your twitch reflex to have the best opportunity to succeed. The flip of the Tony Hawk Pro Skaters franchise in that sense, where Tony Hawk Pro Skater, it's like the system management is very, very quick, very straightforward. They just want you to feel like you're progressing with it, kind of an RPG element. And then it's all about twitch reflexes. Versus Death Stranding, it's like more like you spend a lot of time with the system management section of it in order to enable the twitch reflexes to go more your way. But what I'm ultimately trying to say is I think Hideo Kojima, he is like one of those guys. He's just a genius at making games more or less, I shouldn't say more or less, but it's like you can argue if you like his games, but he definitely is a genius at making his games. And the fact that in the Last of Us, the post Last of Us world, let's not even talk about Death Stranding. Let's just talk about Metal Gear Solid 5. He was much more like Rockstar Games. Yes, there are cutscenes, but if anything, he opened up the Metal Gear Solid formula to where the gameplay, while still having cinematic lighting and and graphics and relatively realistic graphics. Obviously, realism for him is like a very nebulous term. But if anything, in this era, he came out with one of the few games that opened things up and made it more systemic from a gameplay perspective. Ultimately, yeah, there was going to be a lot of people who had been looking to tackle this white whale, who now had the pathway to turning their own ideas into what they had always imagined. They just had to follow a formula. And that ultimately is almost the death of creativity. It's definitely a balancing section there too, in design or filmmaking or whatever you do, writing books. Formulas aren't necessary, because you need something to follow. You need something that you can sell. And if you're kind of deconstructing something that sold well in order to make your thing to help it sell, it's pretty important. If you can also get trapped in it. It's complicated. It like everything. Like, unfortunately, if you're coming to my channel, you're going to find out that I am not somebody who argues for definitive one way or the other. I'm somebody who's like looking for a synthesis, and ultimately, it's like I'm somebody who thinks the term formulaic isn't in itself problematic. Formulaic is just, it could just be problematic if everybody is rushing to the same formula. Yeah, okay.
After The Last of Us became very successful, slowly as months and years went on afterwards, more and more games started to come out with The Last of Us game style, where you play as a character with the gameplay, combat, and everything else is just like The Last of Us.
He showed a clip of this game earlier, and I should have been able to spot it, but it was so like intertwined with everything else that I just thought it was like something I hadn't seen from The Last of Us, for a whole hot second.
And thus, it gave birth to the atrocious style of games that has started to plague gaming for the past 10 years now, being the over-the-shoulder camera. This style of gaming has just about taken over in games. It's nearly everywhere now. Now, you could make the argument saying it's always been there in some games, but not necessarily. Let me explain. Take games like Red Dead Redemption, for example. In that game, the camera is behind John Marston, but not in a way like The Last of Us. You see, in Red Dead Redemption, when you turn around, John will face the screen, and when you hold back on the controller, he'll walk toward you. Now, in The Last of Us, if you hold the controller stick back at you, Joel will just walk backwards. So keep in mind, some games use a style that's like over-the-shoulder style, but it's just like that when walking around as the character. Examples of games that do this are Ghost of Tsushima, The Witcher 3, GTA, Tomb Raider, and of course, the Red Dead games. Those games have a camera style that just happens to be over the shoulder when focusing on the character, and that's the kind of over the shoulder that's good. What I'm not okay with is this kind of over the shoulder, the kind where you just hold forward 24/7. This isn't good game design. It's not fun. This doesn't make a good game. Sure, there's something going on every now and again, but most of the time, you're just holding forward and listening to stuff happen. Companies saw the success of The Last of Us and thought, so all we have to do is just hire some really good writers, make dramatic shots that have nothing to do with gameplay whatsoever, and bam, game. As years went on, Sony kept putting out...
I still think he's being a little, including he could find better examples than Death Stranding. I think Death Stranding is a little bit outside of what he's talking about. I haven't played Horizon Zero Dawn. I was too busy playing the Zelda Breath of the Wild. Have you heard of it? The reason the camera's over your shoulder is because there's only one pathway forward. Like, if this game was more exploration oriented, the camera would move differently. You would be asked to move the camera as though you're looking, it's like the character can't do this and see everything. So instead you move the camera around the character to see like what your options are for moving forward, not just moving forward, but maybe you're moving to the left or even going backwards.
Games from companies with this sort of style, to the point where a good chunk of first-party PlayStation games from Sony all look the same.
Totally. One thing that I really appreciate that Sony has such a distinctive first party, they're trying to hold on to that first party mantle and say, we have games that you can only play here on PlayStation. But the problem I'm having, and people can talk about this, and I think Astrobot at least crashes through this narrative a little bit, is all of those games that PlayStation has, it's like they're all like the same formula, even sometimes the same color schemes, like the vibrancy of the colors, it's still the same. The only thing that changes is the story and the characters. But it's like the gameplay is just too similar. It'd be like if and granted they were limited by their time, but I would say that even side scrollers on the NES all had their own unique things that made them their own games, even though they were so limited to that two-dimensional, your characters here I'm sorry, let me get my camera. You start on the left side of the screen, you move to the right side of the screen. Even then, it's like they went out of their way to find things to make each one a unique, movement and feel kind of thing.
Holding forward. It got to the point where this was so popular in the AAA scene of gaming that even the budget titles were doing it too. I kid you not. Whenever a new game comes out,
no, that's when you can tell something is like seen as the way to sell. Is like when, like you said, budget titles, like something's over and no longer A-list material is when the B-list material, the C-list material starts to crib the same style. It's one thing that it's like what made Marvel fresh in the 2010s and like the late 2000, aughts through the 2010s. Well, eventually the B movies started to do that, and all of a sudden became the Marvel style, like the Marvel style of quipping and things like that. And then when Marvel does it, even though they originated it and it was their style, their brand, then it seems cheap because the cheap things are doing it and everybody's caught up. And we haven't been able to see that in movies so directly because when was the last time we had a multi-decade long spanning series with that many entries? Never. So Marvel's, it becomes a really great example since you can draw a through line of the same series going on while other people are trying to catch up to it. When it becomes just a selling tool, something to market, is when it starts going into decline.
and I want to go back and play a game I missed out on, I have to be concerned if it's an over-the-shoulder camera type game, and that's not a fear I should have.
I forget. I'm sorry. An aside. He keeps bringing up Days Gone, and I'm not saying this as a Days Gone is actually a hidden gem or whatever, but I just think that if I remember correctly, Tim Rogers in his review of Cyberpunk 2077 actually cited Days Gone as a open world game where he started to really appreciate open world games. He was very critical of open world games before he played that one. He said that one kind of changed his mind on what exactly open world games can be. But I think he was probably coming from the other. Basically, what I just said about Marvel, I think applies to this company, which is Ubisoft. They had such a tried and true formula that I want to say they released a Mad Max game in the same formula as the Assassin's Creed games back in around the time Fury Road came out, which oh my God, I'm going to feel so old saying this. What was that, 2015? And I remember the reviews, of that game. The reviews I watched were essentially hey, it's a really, it's great to be in the world of Mad Max and Fury Road, but boy, this Ubisoft formula is showing its age, especially post Breath of the Wild. I think that was the narrative going on at the time. I could be wrong. Please cite me. Leave a comment, lay it out appropriately, because as you get older, your brain starts to push things together. Like that Mad Max game could have come out before Breath of the Wild, but for some reason I'm still thinking that blah blah blah. It's like things just condense. Your brain does compression as time goes on, and but suffice to say, it had to be almost a decade ago, and they were already talking about how long in the tooth that the Assassin's Creed formula was, and they just kept going forward with it, maybe tweaking it slightly, maybe renovating it just enough, but Ubisoft totally did it so well at the right time that they got stuck in their own thing, because it's so easy. Because what you want to do is you want to have a system laid out to where all you have to do is, it's like paint by numbers, even within a company, because then you have so many things figured out. There's so much less uncertainty but it also is a situation where other people can crib, like you said, crib your style. They get the same sheet, they can paint by the same numbers, and then all of a sudden, cheap. Somebody either can do it better than you for less than you, or people are so many things are doing it that you no longer stick out as being innovative, unique, cutting edge. And so, unfortunately, even though it hurts a lot, every now and then you have to basically scrap everything and rebuild from scratch. You hear that, Todd? Howard? Toddy boy. That game engine of yours, you're not going to be able to push that thing into a true next generation experience. I honestly don't believe you can. And if you and Bethesda are capable of surviving, you're going to have to rebuild it from the ground up. I honestly, earnestly believe that. Like Elder Scrolls 6 should be. I have a feeling it's going to be the death march, the nail in the coffin for everything y'all are doing. But you could make it into, which too late now. I'm sure that game's already been in development for nearly 6 years. But you could have made it into like the debut of the new era of Ubisoft, or not Ubisoft, Bethesda. Well, I'm sorry, Todd. We know you're going to be around forever, but Bethesda is not going to be the same beloved thing that it was.
When I want a game. And one of the biggest key examples of how atrocious this gameplay is that there is a franchise that was never intended for this at all, but now it's forever stuck with it.
Tragedy. F in the chat, boys. If you're watching this, leave an F in the comments.
On April 20th, 2018, exclusively for the... Okay, yeah, you get it by this point.
So we're about to get into God of War, which, like I said, this is... Sony really started to reveal that they wanted one specific type of game. So it wasn't even it was the other A-list material too that kind of ruined this style of game. It was just every game was this game.
And Santa Monica Studios released the new entry and the brand new reboot game for the franchise of PlayStation, being God of War. This game was the game that brought back...
Just curious, is Kratos at this point, would you say Kratos is more iconic or more like brand defining than Master Chief? Like, Master Chief was freaking Xbox. I mean, I feel like there had to have been like either Xbox took on green as its color identity because of Master Chief. It had to be that way because Master Chief existed before the Xbox. But still, like, Master Chief was video games. And at this point, I think that if you were to show people Kratos next to Master Chief, they would more likely associate Kratos with video games.
God of War franchise after years of being rotted away since the disappointing prologue game, God of War Ascension, in 2013. When God of War Ascension released back in 2013, this would end up being the last ever Greek God of War game. The reason for this game coming out is still a mystery to this very day. The series already was well wrapped up after 3, and there was already the last PSP game being Ghost of Sparta. So the reason for Ascension is really beyond me. But when this game came out, the game was not received well at all. The poor storytelling, gameplay being massively different from the previous games, bugs, audio issues, and also just the fact this game really felt dull and meh and rushed out the door. We've already had amazing experiences with this franchise, so this one was really tame in comparison. But bottom line is, God of War Ascension was the first God of War game to not be received well, and it really made Santa Monica Studios rethink what they were doing. So in 2014, when Santa Monica started concepting for a brand new God of War title, they were debating on how were they going to do the gameplay. This was something serious for this new title, and even Cory Barlog, even he knew that this was very important, that they must get the gameplay of the game absolutely right. And the reason why is, when it came to the God of War games, something that players love from the series is not only the story and the character Kratos, but the incredible gameplay from this series. This series gameplay and combat of the original trilogy is what made God of War so loved back then. So in making this new one, they had two decisions. They either had to stick with the original gameplay or do something brand new. So in making this new one, they...
It was actually kind of I mean, granted, well, there's a lot that we can talk about here with God of War, but I would say that the original God of War gameplay was something special. And I think, fortunately, we didn't lose it for a complete decade, because I feel like, personally, that Rocksteady took up the mantle, took up the torch, and utilized it for the Batman games, at least the combat. So yeah, but I would say, like, that style of gameplay on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5, I'd be a little bit more like intrigued. I have to admit, I skipped out on the God of War, the most recent God of Wars, because I mean, I'm just not interested in that style of game. Like The Last of Us, I put it down. I didn't beat The Last of Us. I just, watched other people play it after a certain point, because I wasn't interested in playing it.
Really had to tackle the gameplay and how were they going to do it. They were scared that people were not going to like it because of the feedback of Ascension. So what did they do with this brand new God of War game that was going to bring back the franchise in a new way? Did they bring back the old gameplay and make it refined for new generation consoles?
Nope. Forward.
Why can't I ever have anything nice? So with this brand new rebooted God of War game, they did away with the well-known and loved original God of War gameplay style with amazing combat and puzzles. Now Kratos is now on half the screen with that lovely Last of Us over the shoulder.
Half is a bit much, but I can divide the screen in 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. He is 1/12 of the screen, in my opinion. But that does draw into question: does that mean everything to the left is like nonsense or not, important? So yeah, 1/12 of the screen, which is, well, it's 1/12. What is 1/12 in terms of percentage? Quickly off the top of my head, I should be able to figure this out. Let's see. Oh my God, you're sitting here watching me do math. Oh my goodness. Oh no, what have I gotten myself into? Which is 9 times, so 9. So he's essentially, which I think is a sizable number when you're talking about screen real estate. He is nearly 10% of the screen. But then again, so I don't know. I mean, it's I guess essentially this is almost like 3D. This is like the default answer for like what is a 3D game. Like this is a 3D side scroller. Because that's about as much of the screen as a 3D sprite or a 2D sprite would pick up, would present. Like, I would love to see how much of this, I might have to do this. This sounds like a game theorist episode right here. But how much of the screen does Kratos take up, or Joel from Last of Us, versus how much screen does Mario in Mario 3 or Mario World take up? The answers might surprise us. But I'm going to say, like, Kratos is just a smidge below 10% of the screen.
Camera style. Wait a minute. Oh, come on! So with this new God of War game, not only did it come with a new and very interesting take on Kratos' character of him years later calmed down, now has a new family, but now we're set in Norway with new gameplay. And
The Norway part's cool.
You know what I'm going to say?
now I want to get this out of the way. God of War 2018 is...
Brother, I just want to say this, watching your, in real life, you on screen, and take it from me, up your fashion game just a little bit. Get dressed up for the camera. Just a little bit. It doesn't have to be like dressed up, but like be very intentional with what you're putting on. It feels like you just decided to film this after waking up and putting on the clothes that you put on to just lounge around the house.
a bad game. This game's story is great. It's the gameplay I'm not a fan of. While yes, in Ragnarok, they definitely improved upon it by a lot and made it more enjoyable, this still isn't it for me, man. I've talked about the new God of War games versus the old ones before in the past, and if I were you, I'd go check that out just so you can get a better understanding on why I feel this way. But to sum it up, I do not like the new direction gameplay-wise for this series. It doesn't suit a series called God of War. They tried to make it work, and they somewhat deal with the combat and whatnot, but that's not when you don't have to watch for these annoying arrows behind you. They took what already worked for the series and changed it.
That's a great, I mean, and that's a relatively, I was talking about the whole like 3D games and the indicators or the visual language. That idea of like these arrows or directional warnings, I guess you would call them, you know, almost like Spidey sense. Let's just, you know, say that. I mean, the hard part about gameplay is that you're dealing with the basically the same limitations. Like you have the same limitations as movies. You have your eyes and your ears as senses that you're picking up on, and a little bit they add another dimension with the rumble of the controller. That can be an indicator, but and I implore you to try this out. Really feel your senses as a human, a being in a body, and realize how they coalesce to create like a sixth sense of sorts, where you know something is here or there because of this sort of like your brain doing behind the scenes math, combining the variables that you're picking up through audio, especially audio, and general sense, like especially feel sense. It's wild and it's magical, but it's something you can't do in a video game well. And that's why I think like this is one argument for the third person perspective versus the first person perspective, and the these indicators that he's talking about here. This is an argument for them, is that they almost go to represent this sense that can't be communicated, that through just the video screen and the auditorial experience, that it kind of like it picks up the slack of what humans are capable of perceiving without realizing it. So that probably more on that in another video.
Massively. It's like when you take an artist away from a band. That band suddenly loses what it originally had. So thus, it's kind of like what they did here for God of War. They took away what made it so lovable, and now it's completely different. They think they could slap the name God of War and Kratos on a Last of Us sort of style game, and everyone will love it. Now,
I will say this is like they had already built up a lot of free will. That's not it. They had already built up a lot to where God of War essentially met Kratos, and so to have, I think the magical trick here is that they then had a game where instead of Kratos was like at arm's length and was more of like a toy you played with, you were Kratos. You were just right over his shoulder, which means it's the closest you can get without being first person, and it's almost more intimate in gaming to be in this third person perspective, because you're constantly being reminded of who you're playing as. It's one criticism I had about Cyberpunk 2077 when it turned out to be a first person only game. I really wanted to feel like I was with my character the entire time. So, it's almost like this perfect perspective, because Kratos, as it was in God of War 1 through 3 or through Ascension, was so far away that it felt more like you didn't feel as close to him, even though you were controlling him more. It's really hard to describe. I'm working on my words here, but there's a separation at that distance. And then if you were to go first person, there's like a lack of personality. There's a lack of character. The character just basically becomes you, and it doesn't matter like the aesthetics of the character. Like you are always going to be them first and foremost. That this perspective, this is the good thing that this perspective does, is like lets you into another character's shoes while still like you're empathetic for them, but they are still the character. And so I do think, like, I do disagree with him in terms of like this being like some grand tragedy. It was definitely a sidestep or a different direction for the series, but they had earned it. I think that it would be interesting, like a game series I'm much more fond of is Metal Gear Solid versus God of War. God of War was always fun, but it was never like my thing. But Metal Gear Solid, like if I were to experience, like if they were to make an MGS game with this perspective with Solid Snake, how would I feel about that? I think it would definitely have hurt. Like if Metal Gear Solid 5 was just this, there's definitely thoughts to be had there.
Could make the argument saying the fixed camera angles have not aged well, and people were tired of quick time events in this gameplay style as a whole. Great. Okay, first of all, how has it not aged well? I can see everything around me, and there is not one enemy that's not in my sight. I can see everything that's going on, and even when it's not combat, I can see everything just fine.
He brings up a great point here. That gameplay style, I think Dead Space was like an early version of that gameplay style. Like that might have even predated Last of Us. Sound off in the comments if I'm onto something here, but the thing that made Dead Space work so well is it's a survival horror. They used the lack of peripheral vision to their advantage. You're taking care of something, you're focused in on a panel, and all of a sudden a monster comes out and starts attacking you. Versus like God of War, like there's a power fantasy with Kratos where, knowing exactly what your situation is and how you get through it is like I said, the power fantasy. Now, this could also be like, if I'm being generous and I'm arguing for, like, I feel like now I'm kind of arguing for the decisions made in God of War 2016. No, it can't be that. Anyways, the change in God of War that he's referring to here, I would say that it could represent the younger Kratos being like much more in control and like sharp as attack, aware, his perception is wide open, versus the older Kratos who is now having to worry about a child. So that's like kind of taking away from his overall perception, and also the diminishing that comes with age, eyes, ears, your senses just start just slowly turning down a little bit. That said, the first word is God, and gods tend to be immortal beings. So maybe, like if it was like I said, Solid Snake from earlier, Solid Snake is a man. So Metal Gear Solid 4 Solid Snake, if that game played differently, but Hideo Kojima was hitting, or it was referred to in the game that it's like, well, Solid Snake is older. He doesn't have the same capabilities. Like his perceptions are more focused, but because of that, he's not necessarily more capable, but blah blah blah. It's like he can't do what he used to do, but he can do what he does now better than what he could have done it back then. That sort of whole things. The youth versus experience kind of argument that's often made in combat sports. There could have been something there, but I feel like even though they do represent Kratos as aging because they needed to for the story, like I said, God is he is a god. He should technically be kind of frozen in molasses or amber. What was it that the bugs were frozen in what was it called? Jurassic Park? Yeah, that.
What do you mean it's not aged well? Also, when exactly were people tired of the QuickTime events? From what I can gather, nobody was really tired of them. Is it because Ascension burned?
People were tired of QuickTime events in other games. I think that's like QTE was a little bit of a negative connotation, but I don't think they were talking about God of War. That was like, and this is something that often things can be a victim of. It's like God of War perfected the QTEs if you were to keep making games like God of War with QTEs. But also, going back to what I said about things becoming formulaic and becoming cheap, there was a game that I think did more damage than God of War Ascension to the God of War formula, which was Dante's Inferno. Because that was basically God of War and everything but name in terms of gameplay. And probably because of that, it wasn't good God of War. It was just imitation God of War. I would even say it's not Coke versus Pepsi. It's Coke versus insert local chain knockoff cola, kind of thing.
You out of them because, I don't know, they made them pretty mediocre, and I don't know about you, but when God of War 3 hit the scene in 2010, it seems like no one could get enough of them back then. So I don't get the gameplay change. And you're talking to somebody who got into the God of War franchise long after the original series wrapped up. And you could say there's the other argument, when you do something so many times, people will eventually get tired of it. Well, you kinda are right. But here's where you're kinda wrong too. You're right to where if you keep doing the exact same thing over and over again, people will eventually get tired of it. But if you keep it interesting every time, people will be engaged. Take 2D Mario games, for example. We all love them, but
speaking my language.
They're all kinda almost the same. They all still have the basic gameplay formula of go left and right and...
Yeah, I mean, just remember, it was it like late last year, 2023, Mario Wonder came out. Mario Wonder is this like this with a new coat of paint in some ways, but in other ways it is different too.
Platform as Mario and get past enemies and get power-ups. But when the new series came around in the 2000s, Nintendo started milking the crap out of them, and people started to get tired of them.
100%. If there's a Mario blind spot I have, it's New Super Mario Brothers, that entire series, all 4 of those games I don't think I played.
By New Super Mario Bros. 2 for the 3DS. So, when Nintendo heard this by the time New Super Mario Bros. U came out, we now have Mario Wonder, a breath of fresh air for 2D Mario, and it still manages to be the...
I gotta play this game. This might be one of the first games I would play on stream once I get to the capabilities and the audience to justify streaming. Super Mario Wonder might be like my kickoff game.
Mario gameplay, but it's brought back in a brand new way. See what I'm getting at here? I get the argument saying that the original God of War gameplay style could get boring over time, but tell me this, which would you rather have here? An original style of game with fun, amazing gameplay and combat with a fantastic story thrown in there as well, with amazing writing, or just a game that looks like another popular game, but with a massively overdone story with a ton of Oscar bait, but still tries to be a continuation of a game that was already well established and had a decent ending? I'll wait on your answer. So I'll answer your next question. Why does Santa Monica not focus on all the gameplay and whatnot? I'll tell you why. Because in a game where you'd have to spend a lot of time making awesome stuff like this, there wouldn't be enough room for this. The new God of War games ever since 2018 have started taking a page from Naughty Dog's book and decided for the new games in the God of War series is that instead of gameplay being in the front seat throughout development like the previous games, now the story has been moved up to the front seat and gameplay and combat has taken a back seat. And what do you get when you do this? You get yet another first-party PlayStation game with a boring over-the-shoulder camera style that's not much fun to offer besides graphics and story, and that's it. This franchise now has the fan base split. There's one side of people who are so awed by this game's Oscar bait that the only words they could form out the mouth is the words 10 and out of.
That's kind of what I wanted to get to, because he had used the word Oscar and I was looking for a place to step in. So thank you for using the word Oscar again. Like, seriously, I do also feel like they are designing and building these games and milking these games with the idea that, like, all this, like, they're going to get nominated for Best Picture. I mean, and I would say that games are something else, man. Like, you can only get so many of these, and only so many stories are appropriate to tell in this way before it feels like they're being shoehorned. And like I said, I'm going to have an entire video, I think, where I go back and watch all the Game of the Year winners at the Game Awards. But the fact that Astrobot took it this year, and also I don't think there was a game like this nominated. There wasn't a cinematic Oscar bait style game nominated from what I can remember this year. Every game was much more a game first and foremost. Well, I could stand corrected, but we'll see.
There's the other side that can see right through the Oscar bait and point out the mediocre gameplay, or lack thereof, and point out the fact that this franchise is indeed not in its best spot than what it used to be. Again.
Yeah, that was okay. Yeah, so on God of War, I remember hearing that there was like some high level bosses, like optional bosses, like what you would have for, like, say a Dark Souls style game, that, you know, you could go and fight these high level bosses. And all I could think, having played a little bit of the gameplay, is like, why? This game is meant to just get you through the story. Why would you go out of your way to, like, grind this game and try to become perfected at this game? This gameplay style is not meant for that.
I don't hate modern God of War, but from a gameplay perspective, it's not good for a series called God of War that already established amazing gameplay. Whenever you look at the old ones, you think this game is called God of War. Now it's just a reskin of The Last of Us with Kratos. Honestly, if this wasn't called God of War, you'd think this was some other game. These over-the-shoulder camera games keep crawling out the...
That cut was way too smooth. Like, that right there could have been, like, if he were to go into a montage where he took all the games he's criticizing and did that exact same cut, then that could have been the entirety of the video.
Would work. Whatever happened to making amazing games with fantastic gameplay and making a great story with it? Something that will be remembered for many years to...
Say, okay, Here's a great counterpoint he should be bringing up more. Like, look how small Sonic is. I mean, we could go back a little bit. I'm sure he might take up the same amount of screen. This is probably the least amount of screen he could take up. But if Kratos was 10% of the screen, Sonic at his biggest was 5.
Nowadays, it's either Oscar bait driven game or a remake / remaster of an existing game that has good gameplay. What happened? It's almost like companies saw that you actually don't have to try and make a fun game anymore. They just saw the success of The Last of Us and started making all kinds of games be just wannabe movies with tons of Oscar bait and pretty shiny graphics and over-the-top acting to get people all teary-eyed, and suddenly, game is perfect, then their game is instantly getting all kinds of easy accolades and awards that has no game aspect whatsoever and no love and effort and won't be remembered, just easy over-the-top Oscar bait.
Like I said, push back a little bit. I think the people who made God of War really meant it. And I think they had genuine emotion. There's a reason they're up on stage. This was not easy peasy. Now, granted, they were like the second studio to really go after that same style of gameplay and nail it. That all said, though, I think you do bring up a great point. It's okay. It's not that they don't have to try anymore. Well, it is, but it's a little bit different. But I think I'm still going to go back to what I said at the beginning of this and say it is that they had a formula laid out, and a formula is so, like, you stand on the shoulder of giants, right? And it can become boring, predictable, cliched, stale, all those. We have so many words for it, but they cared and they wanted to make something good and something that would, like, stand like the test of time and connect us to people. And if they're going to put all this money into making a game, and that game is not cheap, then they want to have something that they know will resonate. That, like, going and reinventing the wheel every single time you sit down to make a game is, or do anything, is daunting. You have to have like somebody that's gone before you, that's made a trail for you. You're going to follow that. So I think other people, I would agree with you. Other people kind of felt like, oh yeah, we just make it like Last of Us, but set in space. There's definitely those games out there, and it's like it's like I said, stand on the shoulder of giants. They are like, well, we know what Last of Us did, so we just do it like that, and that essentially saves us all the development time and all the problem solving time that Last of Us or other games have already figured out for us, and then we just get to go from there. And sometimes that could create a masterpiece if, like, your jumping off point is something that's tried and true, but you use that to jump off and push it further. You could refine it even better. One of my favorite things is taking something that almost worked but didn't, and then twisting it just enough to make it even more broadly appealing. I think I know why you're trying to do this, and you love the original God of War, the original formula for it, and you think they had it figured out, and why don't we get more of that? And I can agree, there should be. I mean, it almost challenged you, man. It's like, you think that original God of War formula works? I do too. Try to make a game like that, and I'm not saying this flippantly. I mean, like, you obviously have a vision, and I think you strike me as somebody who's a game designer, like, at your core. Like, you wouldn't have made this video if you're not. Maybe try to put something together and see if you can make the next generation of that God of War style game, man.
There. That right there is the problem we have now. Oscar bait. This right here
bait, yep.
is a problem in a lot of modern gaming when it comes to this. And you know what's to blame for all this Oscar bait, over-the-top acting, and all of this lazy gameplay styles that's coming out in recent games? This right here.
We're in agreement on this. Games, okay, here's the problem with video games, is the word game. Game is the problem for a lot of people who made games and came into the industry making games, but they wanted it to be more. They wanted to be taken more seriously. There's a certain person associated who made that game. I'm surprised his name isn't on the cover. Looking at it now, I wouldn't be surprised if his next game, assuming it doesn't flop immensely, if it was Neil Druckmann's The Last of Us, or Neil Druckmann's Intergalactic, The Heretic Prophecy. A lot of people who were totally looking to be taken seriously, their hang-up is the fact that they're making games. Games are ultimately a form of toy and a form of play. That is not what high art tends to be about. It could be, we're moving into a much more interactive world. The prestige and the gameplay could really coalesce, but this is very much like, I have a feeling that this is going to be considered a cul-de-sac of design and of creativity versus a through line or a highway, because this is essentially just taking what worked for Hollywood and worked for prestige by another medium that they respected more, and trying to apply it to their medium of gaming. And the thing is, and we see it right now, I mean, in 2013, it was, the forethinkers were all about the idea that movies were dead or movies were on their way out. Like, they were already upset with Marvel and seeing like the end of movies. But the people who came up and were like, born in the 80s and came up watching movies on VHS and DVD and going to the theater and seeing like the best movies and their favorite movies. Like, we're talking about a generation like the Last of Us came out, 5-6 years after The Dark Knight. We're talking about people who probably one of these game makers, like, filmmaking was something that they really wish they could have done and went into game instead. So I think of this as like, this was just like trying to mature gaming through the use of cinematic techniques. And cinematic techniques are going to become less, are now, as of right now, in my opinion, are being condensed into just our overall language for, it's just social media. I mean, like, I've seen cinematic TikTok videos, man. So this was like I said, this is a cul-de-sac. It's like using another medium's language and techniques, the theatrical, cinematic techniques, in order to legitimize the medium that you're in, and to sort of like be able to tiptoe into the medium you ultimately wish you had gotten into. But I think we're going to get into a place where it's much more abstracted and fun here, and like game is going to be the key. Like, look at like kids playing Roblox today. Roblox is nothing like Last of Us. I'm sure there's a Last of Us Roblox, but it's much more like like the games that we grew up with. It's much closer to being Super Mario than it is to being The Last of Us.
This is what you have to point to. Look, I get that it's not entirely The Last of Us' fault. It's mostly company's fault. But ever since The Last of Us launched in 2013, its impact on gaming has not been a good one. Sure, there are still some good games that come out since then. That's not like it at all. But ask yourself this. How many games that have come out since The Last of Us have either not looked like this, played like this, or overly done story to the point where it feels like gameplay was an afterthought, but the story came first? I know some people can just say, oh, gaming has evolved to be more cinematic and emotional with a well-driven story. Well, let me ask you this. Why does it have to be like this? Why? And what reason does that make sense? I'll go ahead and give the answer.
I would actually offer to say that I think Horizon Zero, or the Horizon series in general, could maybe be seen as a casualty of this style of gameplay, like based on the world that it ultimately ended up in, and like the mechanics that it had built around it, like like hunting. I don't think that this is a hunting perspective, honestly.
The answer is no. Gaming has not evolved. If anything, it's devolved. I don't know if you know about this, but gaming has always had good stories with amazing gameplay. I know, crazy to think about, right? There just wasn't no pretty shiny graphics or over-the-top acting done back then. Lines were delivered perfectly without needing over-the-top emotional moments. Gaming has always had amazing stories with it. So now I'll ask you this. Why should a game have to be like a movie to be good now? I'll tell you. Companies are frankly just getting lazy. With how we progress with technology, games are becoming more and more powerful and better looking as time goes on. But at the same time, companies are starting to get lazy, and they're just thinking that all they have to do is make the game look pretty and give over-the-top acting, and there you go, instant success.
I would say I think Death Stranding would have possibly benefited. Like, I think the idea of going for like super photorealistic cinematic graphics design is a detriment to certain gameplays. I think if Death Stranding was like cell shaded maybe not cell shaded, but yeah, like if it was more stylized and like either in abstract, I think it would be taken more seriously, because I think that the realism and cinematics might, it's what Sony probably wanted and thus made it easier for Hideo Kojima. But I think that like it takes away from the gameplay, honestly, like or distracts from the gameplay. Like the reason he keeps citing it here, which I don't want to use the word unfair, but I think I would not compare Death Stranding to God of War or Last of Us, at least in terms of like the gameplay.
A game that has come out recently that has left an impact on you like before. I'll wait. The reason why is because games nowadays aren't games half the time. They're cinematic experiences that you can play. And yes, there are some games that still come out that are still good at the core with gameplay, but most games you see are normally just the movie type experiences and are not gameplay focused. Games are meant to be a fun and entertaining experience. That's what makes a video game, well, a video game, not being all cinematic and movie-like. If I wanted something cinematic and high-level acting, I'd go watch a movie or a TV show.
100%. Like, yeah, that I completely agree with. Leave TV movies to themselves, like those techniques and that level of storytelling. I don't think you're getting, and if you follow me, you might know that I'm doing a playthrough of the original Baldur's Gate, which I am finding a little frustrating because it's not that interesting, at least yet. Maybe the story really picks up, but still, and granted, that's maybe an example of people trying to do something cinematic in the video game landscape, but I don't know. It's like, if the reason you're playing your game is to get to the next cutscene, then the game maybe doesn't need to exist. If like the gameplay itself isn't what you're wanting to do to get to the next cutscene. And granted, even though I'm sitting here trying to defend it, I also did bounce off of Death Stranding. So I am not going to play your game just to watch cutscenes. I will say that cutscenes are icing. The cake, though, is the gameplay. And you got to nail that gameplay for me to want to get to the icing. I have to feel like I'm completely connected to whether I feel like I'm the character or I feel like I'm in partnership with the character. That's why I'm going to want to watch a cutscene. And also try to keep, even then, I'm probably going to be a little annoyed if the cutscene is like more than 10 minutes, even if it's the final cutscene.
I want movie-like stuff in games. Now, I know this isn't everywhere in gaming, but with most of the time in the AAA scene of gaming, this is almost everywhere. I miss when games were meant to...
Going back to what I was saying, I it's definitely evoking things that I want to talk about more in depth, but I would say this. If you could just release your game as a series of cutscenes with like minimal gameplay footage in between it, and it still feel like you got the full experience, or the experience that the game maker wanted you to get. Like if I could just watch somebody else play God of War and feel like I got as much of the experience, and that's how I feel about Last of Us. I watched somebody play pretty much the majority of Last of Us, and especially the key cinematic moments, and I felt like I got the game. It's like, if the gameplay itself doesn't enthrall and inspire, then why make it a game? Why not just release it as a movie? Like they could release, maybe, in fact, I would say like these kind of games, they should just after you beat the game, maybe there's New Game Plus if you if the creator really feels like they nailed it. But they should also probably put on this front title screen like movie mode or something like that, where you can bring a friend over. Like, I beat the game, like, hey, I beat the game. You want to come over and watch it? And then like you can just press, go to the title screen and press like, cinematic mode, and then you press the button, and all it does is play basically a 2-hour version of cutscenes with like a little bit of like just randomized gameplay in between them to kind of give you an idea of what was going on, and then it just kind of lays out the game for you. Because then there's probably a lot of exposition you could cut out if you're only watching it as a movie, so you could probably bring it down to a reasonable length of watch. and you could show just enough gameplay to give somebody the idea and to create, like, say, Death Stranding, the movie, you know, just show the bits of the narrative bits, because I guess ultimately what I'm saying is, if there isn't enough storytelling through the gameplay, then why not just make it a movie? And why not just release the movie version of your game, especially, like, say, like, around the time the Greatest Hits comes out, just for this cultural zeitgeist, so more people could be like, oh, I experienced The Last of Us. Well, that's a bad example now, because they essentially released the movie version of The Last of Us with the freaking TV show. But or God of War, it's like, I experienced the God of War. I got through the God of War experience not by playing it, but by watching it, because my friend beat it, and he just, like, showed me, like, all the cutscenes that were crucial.
Be a fun experience when you play the game, not when you just hold forward and listen to dialogue half the time. You just have the same old copy and pasted style, and everything just feels so unoriginal because it's all, like, the same.
Oh, and those hidden load screens. I mean, I think it was genius that they came up with this idea, but the fact that I'm sure he could crossfade this with, like, Final Fantasy VII remake, because everybody just used the same idea. Like, you know, like I said, one person comes up with a great idea, and then everybody's going to crib it.
That's what made game franchises so good and unique back then, is that they all stood out from one another. And thankfully, companies like Nintendo and Sega have not fallen into this whatsoever. How would you feel if Mario or Zelda fallen into the over-the-shoulder camera style? You'd freaking hate it, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that Nintendo
already.
doesn't do this. But the big boys over at Sony need to get it together. So in conclusion, did The Last of Us ruin all of gaming? Well, it depends on who you talk to, really. Some will say that The Last of Us made gaming better than it's ever been, ever. Then there's some saying that it didn't change a darn thing. Personally, I don't hate The Last of Us, but I think how it impacted gaming with its style of gameplay and the effect it had on developers to make more story-driven games and less gameplay experience games hasn't had the best impact on the gaming landscape. Who knows though? Maybe one day this style will eventually die out. And maybe one day companies will realize
100%.
maybe we should start focusing on gameplay first and then focus on the story. But until then, let's just hope that game devs continue to make amazing experiences for us in other fields that's truly worthwhile, and maybe one day we'll convince bigger devs on the higher ups to focus on amazing gameplay first in games rather than spend all their time on just trying to get some Oscar bait. But you know what's going to happen? We're going to get away from this style. Naughty Dog's going to come up with a new game franchise that's going to have even more minimal gameplay and even harder story than before, and thus everyone's going to try to copy that. Wait a minute, why does it actually sound kind of realistic? Wait a minute, Naughty Dog, no!
I kind of disagree with him on that last portion, because if Intergalactic, based on what we've seen, is to be believed, I think they're actually fumbling their way backwards. But they're making the huge mistake of keeping the game looking photorealistic. I honestly think if, and I'm going to get into it here in a video here soon, but if Intergalactic's gameplay was a 2D, like, side scroller, like if it was a 2D Metroidvania, I think that people would be totally fine with all the aesthetics that they're setting up, because I think, like, everything they set up, like, play that same trailer. I wish I had the money for this. Play that same trailer's audio, but do it all in a 2D pixel art style, and I think that trailer would have gone down way smoother. Like, we're now running into a situation where we're the realistic graphics and the very emotive characters are meaning that everything else needs to be, like, a higher caliber, and that doesn't totally mesh with video game logic and, like, why we play games. So, like, Intergalactic, if it was a 2D game, I think that would have been or it doesn't even have to be 2D, but, you know, a certain style of game, like a gamey game, an arcadey game, like, I don't know, Star Fox 64, something like that. Naughty Dog, like I said, what he suggests at the end, it could come true, but it would be like a fumble if it did. I do think things are correcting, but I think we're going to see a bit of growing pain, because I think companies are going to still strive for realistic graphics well past, like, when they should. So, well, wasn't that something? Before you move on to the next glorious video in your feed, please leave a comment. What do you think is going to be the next great big overdone trend in gaming? Is it already upon us? Have you already seen what that trend is? Or do you think that it's going to be something that's waiting in the wings? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, enjoy yourself.